Thank you all for coming. I'm really very pleased that Helen Fremont is joining us today for a conversation about her memoir, The Escape Artist, and also her previous memoir, After Long Silence. Originally, the conversation was just going to be focused on The Escape Artist, but after reading it, I realized that the two memoirs are so intertwined that it's really impossible to discuss one without discussing the other. So the format is going to be a conversation between Helen and me, and then it'll be interspersed by Helen reading some excerpts from the book, and it'll be followed by a Q&A. So you're welcome to put comments and questions in the chat. I can't promise that I'll get to all of them, but we'll do our best. And Helen has graciously agreed to go over the hour to make sure to accommodate the Q&A. Also, if you're interested in further discussion about the book, you're welcome to attend the Congregation Beth Elohim Book Group discussion, which will take place 2 weeks from tonight on Tuesday, March 23rd. So let's get right into it. First, I'll start with Helen's bio. Helen is a graduate of Wellesley College, Boston University Law School, and the Warren Wilson MFA program for writers. She was a consultant with the U.S. Justice Department and had a long career with the Massachusetts Public Defender Agency, retiring last year after 35 years. She was also a resident scholar at the Brandeis University Women's Studies Scholars Program, a fiction editor of the Marlborough Review, and has taught at Harvard University, Emerson College, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. She was awarded a fellowship at the Breadloaf Writers Conference and was selected the Common Book Author by Audubon College in Columbus, Ohio. Her works of fiction and nonfiction have appeared in Prize Stories, the O. Henry Awards, the New York Times, Plowshares, Harvard Review, and Lilith, among other publications. Helen lives in Boston with her wife, Donna, their giant mutt, Roshi, a rescued Houston Street dog, and Louie, the cat who deigns to live with them. Helen is an avid rower and outdoors woman. She could be found most mornings before dawn rowing on the Charles River or working out at the Y. She co-hosts the unauthorized Eleanor Wilner reading series for Friends of Writers, Inc. And now that she's retired from her legal position, Helen has more time to spend writing and with her wife. I'm just going to read a couple of very quick excerpts from reviews of both memoirs, and then we'll get into the discussion. For After Long Silence, regarding After Long Silence, Kirkus Reviews said, Fremont is an immensely gifted writer who has vividly reconstructed a sensitive and memorable family saga of terror, hiding, and passing, as well as of personal imperatives over 2 generations around both casting off and confronting the past. Publishers Weekly said, though the story is at times emotionally overwhelming, Fremont writes with an admirable restraint that enables her to turn her parents' life and her own into a triumphant work of art. Now, regarding her memoir, The Escape Artist, Wellesley Magazine said, the best memoirs always get at the complexities and contradictions of human nature. No one is purely good or bad, and Fremont examines and tries to understand why she, her sister, and her parents did what they did. Fremont's prose is raw yet generous in a way all writers of memoir should aspire to. And from the New York Times, graceful, gracious, and an engrossing tour through a dense, if troubling, landscape. So we'll get right into it. So my first question, Helen, is what made you decide to write The Escape Artist, your second memoir, which was published about 2 decades after your first memoir. So what led you to do that?
That is a great question. First, I just want to thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you to Nate and to everyone who has made this possible. Linda, you are, as I've said, the most organized, most thoughtful person who has ever interviewed me. So thanks, and thank you all for coming tonight. So why did I write this? After writing the first memoir, and once it was published, I just thought, thank goodness that's over. I never have to write another memoir. It's really hard. It's really painful. You have to go through, your past. You have to tiptoe across the privacy of your loved ones. And so I really thought, I'm not doing it anymore. But so many things happened after the first book came out that I realized I'd only scratched the surface, and that there was still so much that I hadn't yet understood about my family, and that I hadn't allowed myself to think about, much less express about the family. And I realized the only way I could address that is by writing more. I didn't necessarily think I would write a book, but I knew that I had to explore all of the other things that had gone unspoken. And so I ended up writing and writing and writing. And then after many years, I mean, I think I spent 20 years trying not to publish this. And then finally, I felt it was time. I reduced it to a story that I felt I could contain in a book.
Mm, thanks, Helen.
Yeah.
Well, that's why both memoirs were certainly fascinating. And there was a lot of material there, as you said. So related to that, unlike many memoirists, you made the decision to publish your first memoir after long silence while your parents were still alive. In hindsight, do you wish you had waited until your parents had died?
Well, I published it when they were in their 70s, and it actually took me 6 years to write that book. Most of the time, most of those 6 years was spent agonizing over whether I even had the right to write the book, because the writing was rather quick. Within a year or two, it felt very compelled. Once I found out we were Jewish, and once I found out we had all of these family members that I'd never known existed, and found out how they had all been killed, I really, there was an urgency to write that. But it took me a long time to finally decide to publish it. And the main reason was trying to decide how would this affect my parents, mostly because it was written as a love letter to them. And my father was actually in favor of having our story out there, and he was sort of, I had shown him parts of it and he had been supportive, but he had warned me that my mother would be really upset. And indeed, she was, and I knew that she would be. And he urged me to change names and locations. So I knew that, my father had actually written his own memoir, and portions of it had been published in Harvard Review. And so it was sort of, I wanted to honor the story, and I felt very strongly that um, since I had this family, all of whom were killed and gassed here and shot there and starved there, and there was not a trace of them. They'd all gone up in smoke. There's no gravestones, there's no markers. And so I felt I wanted to have something that would be like a paper gravestone, that would be evidence that all of these people existed. And at the same time, back in the late 90s, there was a movement of revisionist history and a lot of Holocaust deniers. And so I felt I wanted to put my voice there, saying, wait a second, here's actual another voice and evidence of this was a real part of history. So I ended up not wanting to sit around and wait. Maybe, I mean, my mother lived to the age of 94. I didn't want to be sitting on this material and sort of seeing, how's mom doing now? I was hoping that, in fact, I would be able to continue the dialogue with my parents, that I would be able to both have my voice about their and our history, and also be able to be in communication with them. That did not necessarily turn out to be the fact, but in retrospect, um, even though it was incredibly, I mean, there was a tragic outfall from the publication of that book with regard to my family. I actually wish that I had published it sooner, because what I hadn't realized before publication is that there were even more people who had in fact survived and come to the States that, despite all my research back then, I didn't even know existed. And 2 weeks after the book came out, I had people calling me, relatives that I never knew existed, cousins in Iowa City and in Canada, saying, Helen, I've been waiting 30 years to be able to get back in touch with you. I remember you when you were 4 years old. We came to visit your house, but your mother said we could never be in touch with you anymore. She was afraid you would find out that you were Jewish and that we were related. So I made all these connections after the first book. And one of my greatest regrets is that one of the survivors, my mother's very close cousin, Mendel Goldberg, who actually wrote the pages of testimony that were the key to our discovering our past, he died within those 6 years that I was agonized. Should I write this? Should I not? Would it be right? And is it fair to my parents? And I missed the opportunity to get together with him and thank him for the gift that he had given me. I'm in touch with his kids, and they've been wonderful, but that was one of the costs.
Thanks. No,
Yeah.
sounds like there were so many factors that you had to consider at the time. But it's
Mhm.
interesting that you concluded, even in spite of what happened, that it sounds like you don't have regrets, and that you said you wish you had published it even sooner.
Yeah. I mean, it may indicate that I have no moral fiber, but I actually think it was, I really am glad that I did publish it.
Thank you. So tell us about the name Fremont. It doesn't sound like a Jewish surname from Poland or the Ukraine. So what were your parents' original names, both first and last? We're all anxious to know.
Well, yeah, names are a really interesting part of our all the secrets. My father's name was Norbert Julius Fichman, Fichman. And I always knew that growing up. And in fact, Fremont is a completely invented name, and it is invented precisely to not sound Jewish. And I am the only one in my family that has Fremont on my birth certificate, because when my parents came to the States, they came under the name Fichman, and it took them 5 years. They came in 1950, and it took 5 years to apply for citizenship. And when they finally got the application in 1955, they had the opportunity to change their name. And my sister was born in 54, so on her birth certificate, it still is Fichman. I came along in 57. So in 55, my parents wanted to change the name from Fichman to something that didn't sound quite so ethnic. And my uncle, this is my mother's older sister, who married an Italian who happened to be a lawyer, and his specialty was heraldry. And he did all of this research, and he came up with a number of names. I think Fremont is a French Huguenot name. He went back centuries, and he, said these were somehow names that were related to Fichman. And he gave my parents a list of them. This was before I was born, when they were casting about for a name. And my father picked, of all the ones that he came up with, my father picked Fremont because it had the word free in it, even though just one E, but still that was important to him, having spent 6 years in the Gulag. So he wanted, and that was how they chose Fremont. My mother's maiden name, I did not know when I was writing the first book. I didn't even know what her first name was. She went by Magda, but in the book I called her Maria. And after the book was published and all these relatives came forward, that is, children of relatives, they showed me letters that my mother had written to when my mother was a schoolgirl in Poland before the war. She was sending her cousins in America letters in her schoolgirl English and signed it Berta. So after the first book came out, I learned that her first name was Berta and her last name was Porten, Porten. And we didn't know what our grandparents' names were. I did know that my father's mother's first name was Helen because I was named after her. Um, and my mother said, when pressed, that her mother's name was Sophia. We later turned out to be Sarah. And she said her father's name was Mark, which we later turned out to be Moishe. So even after my mother was saying, yes, okay, we're Jewish, she still was withholding certain Jewish characteristics of our family.
Hmm, interesting. Thank you, Helen. So many memoirs include family photos. And why did you decide not to include any photos in either one of your memoirs?
Well, for one thing, we don't have any photos of my parents from before the war. Everything was destroyed. And for another, I was so careful to protect their privacy. And I really didn't want, for that reason, I changed the names of the characters, I changed locations, and photos I just thought would be too inflammatory. And what was important to me was to get the story told. And I was willing to give up, I could have put in photos of myself, but again, I wanted to protect my sister's identity as well. So I left them out.
But even at the time you wrote The Escape Artist, which was
Mhm.
20 years later, no photos either.
No, again, I just felt I guess suppose I could have put pictures of my parents in. To be quite honest, I think that it had my editor asked me, we would have had a conversation about it. But my editor never even asked me, and it didn't occur to me. I was so busy thinking I'm not going to expose anything more than I have to, even for the second book.
Hmm. Okay, thanks. So you mentioned that you changed locations and
Mhm.
names in your first book, and having read both memoirs, I realized that right away. So in the first memoir, you say you grew up in the Midwest near Chicago, and then in the second memoir, which I assumed then you revealed the truth, you said Schenectady or outside of Schenectady in upstate New York. So is there anything else you want to tell us about those choices?
Yeah, that was to honor my parents' wishes and to change not only the names but the locations. And since when the first book came out, my parents were still living in the house in upstate New York, outside Schenectady, that where I grew up. And so I really wanted to get as far away from that as possible. And for the first book, it really didn't matter where I grew up. What was essential is that I grew up in kind of American suburbia. It didn't really matter because there wasn't a lot in there about my story or specifics about where I went to school or anything like that. So I threw them out in the Midwest, and most of that first book concentrates on how my parents survived, and the locations that I did not mess around with were the places in Europe and where they were when armies invaded and so forth. This got me into some hot water when the second book came out, because by then both my parents had died. My sister was no longer living anywhere near the area. The house was sold. Um, and the material for the second book, even though it's still my family, it is much more about me. It's much about my upbringing, my adolescence, my going to college. And I was going to college and driving home 3 hours distance. It became very important geographically to situate myself somewhere, where Boston is the hub. And so it really became an issue of I wanted, again, for the protection of my sister mainly, not name the streets where we grew up and things like that, because anybody in this internet age could go look up and find out. And I wanted to, at least to the extent possible, protect her identity. And I think it's, you read the Kirkus review for the first book. This just really bothered the Kirkus reviewer for the second book, because they were like, oh my God, she's lying. First she said she was from the Midwest, and now she says she's from upstate. You can't believe anything. And I understand that. The fact of the matter is, the reason was, again, just to try to be as protective of the privacy of my family, and the need to protect them from my upbringing was no longer a factor for the second book.
Yeah, I came across that Kirkus review,
Oh,
and I'm thinking to myself, that reviewer really didn't do his or her homework, because you explain. I mean, because you do explain, I think, in your second book that you changed locations.
yeah,
But
yeah,
somehow the reviewer missed that and was accusing you of fabrication or
yeah,
something.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So, you allude, well, I mean, I think some of the people here have read the book, some of the people haven't, but there's certainly, consequences, in your family after you publish the first memoir. So why do you think you ended up being disowned in your father's will and then subsequently your mother's will? Why do you think that happened?
Well, it's a really complicated question. And I think that might have been the prompt for me to write this book, because I have to say that when I got that news that I was disowned, I did not see it coming. And that prompted me to go back and try to figure out happened, what really was going on, because we were such a close-knit family and we literally imploded under the weight of our own secrets. So I think that what I can say is that it took all three, that is my mother, my father, and my sister, all had to collaborate to basically kill me off in a piece of paper, in a codicil to my father's will. And I think for my father, he and I were close and he was supportive of the book, but he was suffering the last 15 years of his life. He suffered from Parkinson's and he was under the care of my mother at home. And while he wanted to continue to have a relationship with me, and he and I continued to correspond after the first book, my mother was absolutely irate. And I finally figured out it's because she was keeping a further secret from her own husband. And she did not want him to find out. And she was afraid that I was, even though I hadn't quite put it together yet, she was afraid that I was getting too close to the heart of what she was really holding. Not just that we were Jewish, but it had to do, and we'll talk later about, my cousin turns out to be my half brother. And so she and her sister were keeping a secret from my father. And I think what she later told me is that she um, basically told my father I didn't want to have anything to do with him. And so at the end, I think he was under her influence and thought, Helen's writing to me, but why isn't she coming home? And the reason I wasn't coming home is because my mother wouldn't let me. And so it is a complicated family dynamic in which my mother also told my sister I wasn't going to have anything to do with them. And, I think that was probably what hurt my father's, what I regret is that my father, my father's feelings were hurt. And I don't think he understood that actually he was being held hostage in some ways by my mother. And my mother was really only trying to protect um, her sister and her, what I later came to believe is her first son, who has always been called my cousin rather than my brother. So that's the short answer. I think the book might be what you have to read in order to get the full answer. But
Well, we'll get into some more of these things very soon. So do you want to read some excerpts now?
sure. Um, I'll start with a section from the very beginning of the book. Um, Sisters are a setup. Shot from the same cannon, you're sent on a blind date for the rest of your lives. My sister Laura and I had a script we were supposed to follow. My mother and her sister Zosha had written it, and they were our role models, which is pretty scary when you consider what they'd been through. During the war, Zosha had saved my mother's life. Or maybe it was the other way around. Their stories were twisted, and my mother and aunt were bound together in ways that Laura and I didn't begin to understand, but we did our best to follow for most of our lives. Although Zosha lived in Italy and we lived in upstate New York, Mom and Zosha's love was formidable. the stuff of legend built on a mythic past. One day, they told us, my sister and I would have what they had. But unlike our mother and aunt, Laura and I didn't have any real wars to test our bond. We had to make up our own. From our earliest years, we liked to go to extremes with each other. We tested our limits, pushed ourselves and each other a little further, a little harder, to see how much we could take, to prove how much we loved each other. I'm going to jump ahead now and just read a very short section that is a little bit about my mother, mostly my father, and our childhood. Of my parents, Mom was the one you wanted to be with. She was strict, but warmer, more patient. Dad, on the other hand, waited for no one and accepted no excuses. His word, he always told Laura and me, was iron. And when he said this, he made a powerful fist with his right hand. He had a sharp wit and a sly sense of humor, but his bitterness ate into everything he did. While he was in Siberia, fellow prisoners had broken his left elbow while trying to steal his clothes. Years later, surgeons in Italy removed the calcified joint and sewed him back together. But he never recovered full use of his arm. My father tried not to speak of his years as a prisoner, but he acted like a man who had lived with beasts. He wolfed his meals in seconds, and nothing my mother said or did could get him to slow down. I can't, he'd say helplessly. It's food. He kept ferociously busy, saw patients day and night, built rock ledges behind the house, planted bushes, mulched trees, chopped wood. One year, he bought 1,000 evergreens and planted them across the grounds, along the driveway, all over the lawn. He was a colossus of efficient, if furious energy. At night, his shrieking nightmares jolted us awake. The next morning, my mother would dismiss them with a weary shrug, saying, "The gulag again," as if genocide were just one more annoyance that kept intruding into our lives. We never knew when an image or a sound or a fight between my sister and me would trip the invisible wire, and my father would blurt out a horrifying incident from the camps. Or my mother would cry, "I should have died with my parents. Don't you understand? We shouldn't be alive." My sister and I would freeze. The whole planet froze as we watched our parents being stolen from us by the past. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Helen. Those are
Sure.
great passages. So what is your present day relationship with your sister, and what did she think of The Escape Artist, your second memoir?
I have not heard a word about what her thoughts on The Escape Artist, like the first book, which I sent to her and to my parents before it came out. I heard from my father right afterwards, and he congratulated me and so on and so forth. I never heard from my mother, never heard from my sister. To this day, I don't know whether my sister read the first book. And the second book, again, before it came out last year, I sent it to her, and I've never heard her response. So I don't know if she's read it. She had, and I have texted, sadly, my cousin or half brother, depending on we can get into that later, just died last week. And so we just texted. But we have sort of a cautious, estranged relationship at this point.
Well, I think that answers it, because I'm sure there's a lot, when you say cautious and restrained, because I'm sure that
Right.
there's a lot, there's a lot on.
Well, and I should say estranged, because I
estranged.
think, yeah, I mean, I think I feel great compassion for her, although, I mean, we've both been through a fairly traumatic childhood and adolescence, but but the fact of the matter is, I'm scared of her, frankly. I am afraid of, and in some ways we love each other very, very much. And it's, sort of a classic abusive relationship. So I think that I feel safer if I am just, happily separate from her, if we just sort of love each other from afar.
Hmm. And well, so almost ironically, she was the one who originally encouraged and initiated the research. So I
Yeah.
think that was
Yeah.
rather ironic in a way.
I could not have written the first book, without her. I mean, in many ways, I couldn't have written the second book without her either, but not with her encouragement. She really was the driving force behind our research and our confrontation of our parents and our encouraging our parents to talk with us about it. And she was the one who really insisted that, in your earlier question about why not wait until your parents die, I mean, she was the one who insisted that I have a right to my own voice and that it's imperative that I write the book. At the last minute, she sort of flipped, you know, um, and sided with my parents and said, "Wait a minute, I never said that." But for most part, she was very, very supportive.
Hmm, interesting. So you already talked about, I guess, what I would call the big reveal
Yeah.
about your cousin Renzo, and I'm so sorry to hear that he died recently.
Yeah.
So my question is, did you discuss with him what you found out, and what did he think of when he found out that he was actually a half brother and not a cousin? And then in conjunction with that, what was your aunt's reaction to your first memoir?
Well, I'll start with the last question first. I don't know what my aunt's reaction to the first memoir, since she lives in Italy, or lived in Italy. She finally died at the age of 99. Um, but I never sent her the book. It wasn't published in Italy, and so I rationalized, that I would just not bother telling her about it. And she and I seem to have gotten along famously, as long as we didn't talk about anything. We pretended, if you've read the first book, I had gone to write the first book in Rome, and we got along beautifully until at one point she sort of had a breakdown, thought I was a Nazi spy and all of that sort of thing. And if you, at the end of that book, you would not know that, in fact, about a month after that incident, we got back together and we didn't mention it, and we just pretended it never happened, and we just got along famously. And so I didn't bring up the book. We, went on as if nothing had happened, which was really the modus operandi of our family, until you just couldn't do that anymore. With my aunt, because she lived in Italy, it was possible to do. So the other part of the question, which I have conveniently forgotten, was
Renzo, what I mean, what did Renzo
Renzo.
think about what you discovered?
Yeah, the irony is that it was Renzo himself who first suggested it. And he suggested it not recently, but way back in 1992, when we first found out that we were Jewish. And I told him, when I was visiting my aunt in Italy, this was in 92, I took a leave of absence from my work as a public defender in Boston, went to Italy to write the book, the first book. And it was my cousin Renzo and his wife who were very eager to find out what we learned about our family, because he knew that we were researching the past. He knew that my sister and I had gone back to our parents' hometowns and was now Ukraine. And I finally ended up telling him, guess what? My mother's Jewish, my dad's Jewish, and your mother is Jewish. And he thought about it, and we started comparing notes, and he said, "Oh, this makes so much sense." But then he said, "I would not be surprised if I'm your half brother."
Mm,
And the reason he said that was he's always been so much more attached to my mother than his mother, my aunt. And even though he was raised in Italy by my aunt and her husband, the Italian count, he has had no use for his father, had no use for his father, the count. And I should say, for anybody who hasn't read it, and this isn't a huge reveal because it's such a crazy story that there's a lot of background to it. Um, that my mother was most likely um, impregnated by one of the officer who helped her escape from Poland in 1942, who was an Italian officer and gave her, cut her hair short, dressed her in an Italian soldier's uniform, and got her to march out with the Italian army from Poland. And it's likely that he was in fact her boyfriend. And my father knew nothing of this. My father was in Siberia at the time. And my mother made it to Rome and was raising, as part of the household, was raising this child, Renzo. And all of a sudden, 6 years later, well, actually, it was in 1946. So it was almost 4 years later, my father shows up. He escaped from a Siberia, and no one expected him to turn up. So my Renzo was so attached to my mother that he didn't want to have anything. He wouldn't even let her out of his sight. So my mother marries this strange guy, and my cousin Renzo was in the room on their wedding night, because and my father could never understand this. Why would, his bride's nephew have to sleep in his room with him? So, anyway, Renzo is the one who came up with the idea. He's always been attached to my mother. And when my mother finally emigrated with my father to the States, Renzo was already 8 years old. And it was, I think, such a trauma for him to lose the person whom he thought of as his main squeeze. So at the time, we did the math. When did my mother escape? When miraculously she wound up in Rome at the same time that Renzo was born, 9 months after her escape. It was easy for us to figure that out in 1992, but we had just found out we were Jewish, and we just found out we had all these members of the family who were killed in the Holocaust. And whether he was our brother or our cousin, who cared? It just seemed so neither here nor there. It didn't matter. And it really wasn't until I was disowned that I realized it mattered enormously, that it was in fact the secret that was at the heart of all of the rest. And it was something that my aunt and my mother were trying to keep, both from Renzo and also from my father. And they succeeded.
So even though your mother's so-called nephew was in the room on their wedding night,
Yeah.
your father never suspected anything, as far as you know?
As far as I know, no, because he used to, when I was older, he would be so hurt. He would be so upset, and he felt really, and I think rightfully so, he felt terribly rejected by my mother. He felt that her heart really was in Italy. I mean, in fact, in our family, the central love affair was really between the two sisters, and the husbands were just for show, for decoration. And I think that it was a number for a number of reasons. So I think my father was always felt left out of his own marriage and was very bitter about it, and would complain when I was an adult and say, why wasn't my wife more interested in me than in her nephew? Wherever we went, she would bring this 5-year-old brat with her, because when he came to Rome and emigrated, he had just gotten his medical degree in Poland when he was arrested by the Russian police. He had to learn Italian, get his medical degree in Italy, but there were no jobs for him in Rome. So he went up to the Alps to a TB sanatorium to work there. And my mother continued to work in Rome. And this was already in 1946. And she was living with her nephew in Rome and raising the child and working as a translator. And she once a month would take the train to visit my father, and she'd bring her nephew on the one. So the newlyweds for the next 3 years were stuck with this, as my father called him, a little brat, who he considered really spoiled. Like, why wasn't this kid with his mother back in Rome? So I think the fact that my father continued to complain about that to me suggests to me that it didn't occur to him, or he didn't want to know. I don't know.
Mm. And did your mother ever suspect that Renzo had guessed the truth? Or did,
I think that's why she cut me out. I think that's when she was once the story, once my sister and I started talking with our, Renzo and his wife, that was terribly threatening to them, because to my mother and her sister, um, which is why I mentioned before that Zosha had this nervous break and thought I was a Nazi and came to spy on her. It's because she realized that I had talked to Renzo about it, and they were very, very worried that this would upset him. And mind you, this was Italy, and Renzo is a count. He inherited his the only real Catholic in the entire family is the Italian count, who is a lawyer that my aunt married, who was the only reason they were able to survive the war. He was actually smuggling Jews out from Poland, including my mother and the woman he eventually married, my aunt. So Renzo, because of this secret, they were able to give him the identity of an Italian Catholic count, raised in the finest Jesuit schools and so on and so forth, as opposed to being a Jewish bastard child. So that was the big secret.
Mm. So how do you presently feel about your Jewish identity? Of course, we're a synagogue book group, so this is an inevitable question, in one form or another. And just a couple of related questions. Do you consider yourself Jewish? Do you practice? And then how do you feel about Catholicism and religion in general? So it's a lot of questions, but bottom line is
the same. I feel that from the moment even before I knew I was Jewish, when I started suspecting I might be, I felt so much more like that felt like a good fit. It felt like that was who I am, for no good rational reason. I mean, I really didn't know why I had this just sense of being Jewish. And I was raised Catholic, but really badly. I sort of went from being a bad Catholic to a bad Jew because I didn't know a thing about Catholicism. For us, growing up, Catholicism wasn't a religion; it was a cover. It was a mask. It was skin deep, or not even that deep. It was just in name only. And when I was a little kid, I had to go. I guess at age 6, I had to go to First Communion. But after that, my mother's like, okay, you got your communion, you're Catholic, good. Now you don't have to go to church anymore. You can if you want to. My sister wanted to. So my mother took my sister to church every Sunday, but I was free to watch, the NFL Today on TV, which conflicted with church. And I considered the NFL far more interesting. So, and my mom was fine with that. In fact, the messages that we got growing up about Catholicism was that it was kind of a horrible religion. And we were never allowed to go to confession because my mother said that confession was a Catholic institution that had enabled Catholics to commit atrocities throughout history with a clear conscience. So in some ways, we were, Catholicism got a bad rap in our family. And whereas I think my parents' closest friends were Jewish Holocaust survivors. We went to Jewish weddings. We went, I went to bar mitzvahs as friends of mine. So it felt later when I found out, oh, actually, there isn't a single non-Jew on either side of the family. It wasn't like I had to oh, changed my way of thinking. I thought I was Catholic, but now in fact, it was just like, oh, thank goodness, this makes so much sense. It's just that fits. The problem was I was 35 years old, and my mind wasn't as, I thought, oh, I'm going to run out there and learn Hebrew and Jewish history, and I'm going to mitzvah. And I just was too lazy. Whereas my sister, like in 45 minutes, she did all of that, got bat mitzvah, joined a temple, went the whole way. And I think that both of us feel very, very committed that we are Jews, but I think she's probably a good Jew. And I'm, just in that she learned the basics, and practices. But I am much more of a Jew. Um, I don't know. You guys probably can explain it to me better than I can, um, uh, because I feel like a secular Jew. I think, as far as religion, I think there's something bigger out there, but I don't know whether organized religion is necessarily, the be all and end all. But if I had to pick one, I'd say, yeah, I'm Jewish. There's no question.
Mhm. Good, thanks. So what do you want the reader to come away with after reading one or both of your memoirs?
Mm. Um, I think, well, I don't know what the reader gets to come away with whatever they want. One thing could be like, oh my God, these are the craziest people I've ever met. I don't want to have anything to do with them, which is a perfectly legitimate response. I think what I come away with is, I'm just amazed that the resilience that people have. I have such admiration for my parents. I mean, I just have no idea how they managed. And even with all the secrets and the deceptions and all of the um, actual, sort of unwitting transmission of trauma from one generation to the next, I still am in awe of them and think that everyone is really doing the very best they can. And I think that's my takeaway. And even with my sister, we had a terribly traumatic and also incredibly loving, I mean, a real love-hate relationship that's incredibly passionate and violent and, and traumatic. And yet I really feel for her. I think that everyone is just doing the best that he or she can. And I think stories, it's really important to speak your truth. I mean, I think that that's one of the things that I felt was adding a layer of problems to our family. I mean, one doesn't come out of the Holocaust intact. There's no way that you're going to come out in one piece. There's no way you're going to be able, just the epigenetics of it, have a next generation that's going to be, well adjusted. That's just not going to be the case. But I think when you add on um, deception, keeping things suppressed, repressing certain parts of yourself, compartmentalizing, I think it makes things really crazy. And I think that that's why, getting back to your question, do you feel you should have waited or not? I think that it's really important to be able to speak your truth as best you can and honor the fact that your truth is not the same as your sister's, as your mother's, as your friends, as yours was yesterday. We're all, yeah, changing.
Well, that leads into my next question. From listening to your recording of your conversation with Helen Epstein,
Mm.
the Zoom event sponsored by the Museum of Jewish Heritage, I learned that her book, Children of the Holocaust, had a profound effect on you. So please talk about what you learned from that book and your relationship with Helen Epstein.
Yeah, Helen Epstein, I did not know her at all. In her book, The Children of the Holocaust, which is a nonfiction book, in which she touches on her own upbringing as a child of Holocaust. And then she was a journalist and interviewed a number of children of Holocaust survivors and wrote their stories in this book, Children of the Holocaust. Came out in 1979. at a time when I was, let's see, between my second and third year of law school. And I happened to see the paperback, of all things, in like a drugstore paperback rack, and I picked it up because I was all very intrigued. I felt that even though our family wasn't Jewish, I knew that our parents had survived the war. And so I started reading it, and it felt as if this woman, this writer, had grown up at my kitchen table. She was saying and describing a way of feeling about her parents that I had never heard anybody else speak out. And it was so much my experience. Just how can I eat? What right do I even have to have my own life when the whole purpose is to be some sort of proof that my parents didn't survive in vain, that there was some reason for them to go through that hell. So it really was profound. And I remember just reading a few sentences and then bursting into tears and having to go out for a run and then coming back and reading. And just, it moved me so profoundly. And I had to say, okay, we're not Jewish, but this is otherwise. Everything is exactly the same. And I sent a copy to my sister, and she read it and she said, wow, this is so much like our experience. And I sent it to my parents too, because this was really life-changing for me. And they're like, I don't see what that has nothing to do with us. What did you see in this book and then I didn't think about it for a number of years. And then, as it turns out, Helen Epstein moved from New York. She's originally from New York. Well, she's originally from the Czech Republic, from Prague, but she came here as a 3-year-old, lived in New York. And then she moved with her husband to Boston, to Cambridge. And she was teaching a course on nonfiction. And in 1983, so this was like 4 years later, I was already working for the board of bar overseers in Boston, and I saw that she's teaching a course, and she was going to be featuring her book, and I was like so excited to meet her. So I signed up for this course. I went to meet her, and by this time I had I'd read her book like 17 times and underlined it all in red ink, and went up to her and just said, oh my God, you've changed my life. This is, even though we're not Jewish, but da, da, da. And she was just very kind of brushed me off, like, okay, that's nice. And I just, felt so disappointed that for 4 years I've been holding this inside. And then fast forward another few years, it turns out my boss at the public defender's office had grown up with Helen's best friend from journalism school. And they introduced us again as, by then I was already writing on my own. And it turns out Helen and I became very good friends and we're writing partners. And she helped me a lot with The Escape Artist. She worked very closely with me on it.
So besides that book, what other books or memoirs have influenced your writing?
Oh, gosh.
Served as inspirations to you, either related to the Holocaust or not related?
Oh, there's so many. I have to start with Solzhenitsyn's work, and all of everything he's written in the Gulag Archipelago series is and I was reading that stuff when I was a teenager. I was reading it as he was being published. I was reading it as soon as it came out in translation. And my father, of course, was reading it when it was still in Russian and then in translation. And then Jean Amarie's At the Mind's Limits. These are Holocaust books. Yafa Elaich's book, Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust. Saul Friedlander's book, When Memory Comes. He was a child survivor and he was hidden by Catholic nuns and didn't find out he was Jewish until after the war. That's another. And then memoirs, just to get a sense of how you write about yourself without, it being entirely, well, it is always self-referential, but Lucy Greeley's memoir, Autobiography of a Face, is just phenomenal. It's not about being Jewish, it's not about secrets, but she's just a phenomenal writer. And What else? I think this is sort of an autobiographical novel, but I Never Promised You a Rose Garden by Hannah Green. And again, I read that when I think when it first came out in the 70s, or I think it was written by Joanne Greenberg, but she used a pseudonym at the time. Um, and then there was a whole wave of memoirs that came out, Mary Carr's Liars Club, and there's so many excellent, excellent memoirs.
Mm, thanks.
Mm.
So I think, having read both of your memoirs, I think, in my opinion, they have great cinematic potential. So I was just wondering, has anyone approached you for the film rights?
There have been, not so much during COVID, because but after Long Silence, there were a number of options that somebody got a few options, and then they expired, and then they renewed them, then that went nowhere, and then I'm not going to hold my breath, but yeah, people. I think making a movie is on a whole nother planet of complications, but thank you for suggesting it.
Well, I mean, I'm picturing your mother dressed as an Italian soldier.
Soldier, right?
I mean,
Right.
there's just so many scenes that
Yeah.
so it looks like as of now there's no film in the works.
No, no. Any filmmakers out there, feel free.
Okay, so you have a law degree and you also have an MFA. You had a long career, 35 years working as an attorney, and you've also written two highly acclaimed books. So do you want to talk just a little bit about your career trajectory?
Yeah, I always wanted to be a writer. I never had any particular interest in being a lawyer. I mean, my uncle was a lawyer, but that was sort of not something that immediately drew my attention. I think from a young age, I was always keeping a journal. I always wanted, and I always wanted, like as a little kid, I wanted to grow up and write a novel that was my parents' story, because it was such a dramatic, Dr. Zhivago story, just their love story, and star-crossed lovers, and father in Siberia, mother marches. Even though I didn't know the story, just the bare bones were so amazing. And it was made very clear to me that writing was not a career. Law was a career, medicine was a career. I suppose a business degree might be a career, or a PhD, but writing didn't work. So I kind of thought, okay, when I go to college, I have to put away childish things like writing. But even so, I became an English major. I mean, not exactly the most career forward major. So I considered my options after college and thought, okay, I can go to medical school, I can go to law school. Law school, that's only 3 years, and you don't have to sit in labs all day. I'll take law school for 200. So that's what I did. I went to law school, and I was really not happy in law because I didn't really particularly want to be a lawyer. The only thing that interested me and that I did do while I was in law school were these clinical programs in which I did legal aid, and I did I worked with in criminal defense, because those were people I could identify with. I just had no interest in banks or tax or anything that was going to make any money, apparently. But even so, after law school, I ended up going into the Peace Corps because I could not imagine sitting behind a desk. And I went to South Africa, to Lesotho, which is actually a small Black nation surrounded by South Africa, and really thought, okay, I have a law degree, but I don't have to be a lawyer, and I'll just do whatever I want. And ultimately, I came back to the States and found that there were certain you literally cannot make a living. My mother and father were absolutely correct. It was a really hard way to make a living as a writer. It wasn't impossible, but I was really interested in doing creative writing. I didn't want to be a journalist. So I just fell back on my law degree and got a job first prosecuting corrupt lawyers, and then working in the public defender's office. And I really felt committed to that work.
Mm.
Oh, and that gave me, that paid my rent, so that when I was in my 30s, I was able to go back and take graduate courses in fiction writing. I always wanted to write fiction, not memoir. And then finally, I was able to get an MFA as a low residency. So I didn't have to leave my job. I could keep working full time as a public defender and also get an MFA over a number of years.
So are you currently working on another book? And if so, what's its genre?
I am once again really happy to be done with memoir. I mean, in some ways, it's like exactly how I felt after Long Silence. Like, thank you, I can just make stuff up now. So I am working. I can't say it's a book yet. I just am writing stories and playing with characters, and it's really fun. It's sort of nice to return to sort of the sandbox where you get to make stuff up and not worry that you're going to get beheaded if you say something that will hurt someone's feelings.
So it sounds like it's either a novel or short stories or
Yeah,
yet
yeah,
to be determined.
yeah. To be determined, right? Yeah.
Well, whatever it is, we're looking forward to it.
Thank you.
So
I should add that the one
yeah.
thing I cannot write that you can
Oh.
is poetry.
Oh.
And I've seen some of your work and I'm just so impressed, Linda. That's
Thank you.
really cool.
Thanks. So I just checked the chat, and surprisingly, maybe because I had so many questions myself, surprisingly, there don't seem to be any questions. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, just not anticipated. So I'm just going to give everybody another minute or two, but if there are no questions, I think we're going to go to our closing remarks then. So first, I'd like to thank you, Helen, for joining us today to discuss The Escape Artist and After Long Silence. Really enjoyed having the conversation with you.
Thank you.
And I'd also like to thank all the staff at Congregation Beth Elohim, CBE's Executive Director, Alan Herman, Assistant Rabbi Matt Green, Director of Member Engagement, Karen Gerwin, and a special thank you, as always, to Nate Jaffe, whose new title is CBE's Admin and Communications Support Coordinator. So thank you all. And I want to thank everyone who attended today. Congregation Beth Elohim Book Group members, CBE members, community friends. Now, please let your friends and relatives know that a video of the event will be available. I'll be sending out the link sometime this week, and it will also be posted on the CBE website. And if you'd like a further opportunity to discuss Helen Fremont's memoirs, you're welcome to join us at the next meeting of the CBE Book Group, which will be Tuesday, March 23rd at 7:30 p.m. If you're not already on the book group email list, or if you don't already receive the CBE advisory, you'll be able to reply to me directly when I send out a follow-up email to everyone who RSVP'd to this event. So I wanted to wish everyone a good week. And Helen, like you wanted to say something.
I just saw in the chat that someone did put in a question. So I wonder, I don't know, I'm happy to answer it if you would like.
Okay, well, sure, we like questions. Okay, this is from Lila Foldus. Thank you so much for your wonderful work. Could you talk more about writing about secrets? Did you struggle to find words? You put unspoken things into words with such precise and evocative language.
Anybody who doesn't want to stay for this, you're welcome to leave, because that was a lovely closing remark.
Well,
But
we're getting
just
quite finished, so just in the nick of time, can't I question your mind?
but I think that what's really, really hard to do about secrets is you start, and what I found was really difficult is the very nature that they're secrets is somebody has a stake in silencing you. And that is something that I found impossible to break through if I even imagined that anyone would read what I'm writing. So for the first 30 to 300 drafts, I just um, I just wrote for myself. In fact, I wrote promising that I didn't even have to read what I was writing. And I simply needed to say it. I needed to put it down on the screen or on the piece of paper and really make that promise that no one was going to look at it. And then I kept that promise and eventually, looked at it myself, and I would be surprised because you don't know that you really know things until you sort of tap into that unconscious free association. And so I think that's the first rule for me of writing is, especially if you're getting into tricky territory where someone does not want you writing something, including yourself. The idea of publication has to be completely off the table. Don't even go there, because that will silence me if I start thinking, oh, what would my sister think, what would my mother think, what would my friends think? That silences me right there. I can't even put a word to paper. I can't even begin. So that's the first thing, is only to find out what I'm thinking. And gradually you decide what are the things that are important to speak up. And in sharing with other writers, I think what ultimately I chose to publish this because I realized it's not just my story, that there's so many. It's the reason I read, because I feel not so alone and not so freakish when I read about other people and what they're going through. So it's really a kind of, you got to trick yourself into thinking no one's going to see this. And in fact, nobody sees 90% of what I write. And that's a kindness that I give others by not sharing my work. And then certain things are after showing to a few people. My wife is my very first person who's like, no, not so much, or this is important, and then maybe I'll have the courage to show it to a few other readers, and then it sort of goes from there.
Mm.
um, why do you think your sister went along with silencing you? I'm really happy to go on, but I also don't want people to feel compelled. If you do have a question and have to get going, feel free also to just, I have a website, helenfremont.com, and feel free to email me at info@helenfremont.com, and I can answer you at your leisure. But in the meantime, my sister and I have a really, really complicated relationship that I didn't go into very much here, but it was very volatile. It has either been, we are all in, I mean, so enmeshed that you really can't tell we are a unit, or literally at each other's throats. And throughout our lives, we sort of were like this. And when it was good, it was very, very good. And we came together and we did, just this amazing amount of research and found out all about our history and our past. When it was bad, it was, let's put it this way, I wound up in a battered women's shelter at one point, thanks to, my sister. So I think that it got to a point where the fact that we were so close also was toxic. And so I think that for my sister, her rage that I was getting, even though she was the one who said, you have a right to your voice, you have a right to your voice, you have a right to your voice, all of a sudden there was it was literally from one moment to the next, it clicked for her that if I have a voice, then she doesn't. And this is my story, and I'm not telling her story. And she's welcome to tell her story, but she doesn't want to. So I think that her rage that I took her advice and actually did put my book out there, um, was infuriating. And I think that was, okay, off with your head. You are out of this family. So I think that that's why, and I think that she goes back and forth. I mean, then she pretends that, what, moi? I never did that. So I think it really is just a flip. It's not a healthy relationship. Um, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on your sister becoming a psychiatrist. Well, that is rich, isn't it? I mean, having depended on psychiatrists for most of my adult and childhood life, I would have to say, you know, um, I would not be surprised if my sister's a good psychiatrist. For one thing, she's a very, very good listener. She's a very empathic person, but not unlike many people. You may have enormous insight on what's going on in other people's lives and be unable, and this is certainly true for me, I'm excellent at being able to analyze what the marital problems of my friends are, but when it comes to my own, I am completely helpless in figuring out what's going on. So I think that it is, I think, a rich irony that my sister's a psychiatrist. Certainly she has an awful lot of experience, having been hospitalized and having gone through quite a bit of on the consumer end of psychiatry. So
Well, we are open to other questions if anybody has them, or as Helen says, you could always contact her through Helen's website, or let me know and I can contact Helen.
yeah,
Since we're back to talking about your sister,
yeah.
I just thought of something else that I didn't ask you, because at one point your sister had this really outrageous accusation against your father.
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, it almost, it didn't really make sense. And is there anything that you want to say about that?
Yeah, I think that was, an example of, at a certain point, my sister thought that she had recovered memories that my father had sexually abused her and me. And I think that um, really was, just what now was going to come out of her mouth. I couldn't believe it. But by the same token, I respect, if someone has an experience that I don't share, it's not, I don't have the right to discount their experience. Except this is my father. I kind of have my own opinions about my dad, and I certainly have my own opinions. I mean, she was insisting that I was repressing my own memories. So I think it was just very crazy making. And I think that there are so many, we don't understand how the mind works. I sure don't. And whatever she was working as with children who had in fact been sexually abused at the time. And I think since it's entirely possible that she, since it was all pre-verbal, may have, conflated her patient's memories with her own. I don't know. I really can't speak for her, but it did make me kind of crazy. And I think the fact that I did not share her memories made her very angry with me, because it was important to her that we have exactly the same experience. So
Hmm, thanks. I'm almost afraid to close again. I'm afraid
yeah, you'll close it. Well,
if I start closing, and some other wonderful question is going to come out. But if you think of anything afterwards, there'll be opportunities to get in touch with Helen. Also, we're going to discuss it at the book group in 2 weeks.
mhm.
So anyway, I don't want to
Thank you.
repeat all my thank yous, but
Yes, thank
anyway,
you.
Helen, this was great.
Thank you so much, Linda. And thank you, Nate. And thank you, Rabbi Green, and everybody who came. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, no, this was great. And thanks to everyone for attending, and have a great week. Keep reading, and stay well, and Thanks for joining us, and thank you, Helen.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye-bye.